think there are a couple of kind of significant dates where we saw changes, and I would say around about 1999, 2000, the first families that were arriving in Manchester who were asylum seekers, not all were Roma, but at that time significant numbers were Roma. I would say then a lot of people, even people who professionally should have known that these families were Roma from Eastern Europe, didn't know. So at that time, I would say there was no experience of these families. We had no understanding of them being from a Roma background. My role at that time was to support them to access education. We were notified where they were living, and I would go out knocking on doors. I can honestly say I got in hardly any. We hadn't managed to build any relationship at all. I'd knock on the door and they'd say, oh, come back in half an hour. Hardly any families at that point we were able to build relationships with and access education. I don't think they were used to professionals knocking on their door and offering support. So it was probably an alien concept to have somebody knock and say, I'm here to help you, we want to support you, we're here to support you to access education, that in Manchester everybody's expected to attend school or get an education. So that was, I don't think that had ever happened before. And they were asylum seekers, so they were placed in areas where they had no choice. And moved around, relocated, often, you know, didn't get status, so may have been here and did go. But there are some positives from that time. You know, we still have people in Manchester. In fact, I think that's the time when people made links to Manchester and started to feel welcome, because the Romanian Roma that came later on did kind of say, oh, we knew somebody that was here before, or we'd been here before, or this family member, so it must have stayed in their mind because they came back. In 2007, we had significant numbers of Romanian Roma that arrived in Manchester in quite a concentrated area, and it almost felt like 2 or 3 streets. And I think the local people weren't used to such high numbers moving into such a concentrated area, and there was I don't know, things around bins, things around people standing in gangs, and I'm using the word gangs because that's the word we would use, but people have laughed at me for using that term because they'd say, Julie, we're not a gang, we're just a group of people. There's no negative to standing in a group of people, but local people were frightened of gangs, so it was perceived. So it's not that the Roma were doing anything wrong, it was the perception of what they may have been doing. So there was quite a lot of myths, there was quite a lot of things flying around about how they were earning their money, oh, they're being dumped here. And there was a lot of work done by counsellors and the police and the education department to understand some of the tensions, but also to try and overcome them. And specific pieces of work around getting small groups of people together to understand one another and get along. And I think all of that intervention obviously did work, but also naturally people move in and then we'll feel comfortable and start to move out slightly, and relationships just develop. It's really difficult with the media, and I don't know, it's almost like there was the Big Fat Gypsy Wedding that everybody speaks about. And
so tell us about that. What is that?
Okay.
So people will know.
Okay, so Big Fat Gypsy Wedding was a programme that it was on Channel 4, and it portrayed, I don't know whether they were trying to say they were English Romani and their practices around marriage, and there was pictures of young girls that were half undressed. The wedding dresses were enormous, it was parties, it was drinking, it was excess really, and there was uproar because it painted the whole community in a negative light, but also it painted women, it was quite stereotypical, I think that's fair to say. but people loved it and people watched it, and there was an interest that I think there's never been really there before, you know, that interest in a community that is, I don't know, that people think they're romantic and don't really know people from that community. So it was on their TV and people were watching it. And actually, I'm always quite cautious around the media. And at that time, because there was this massive interest in travellers and Roma and gypsies, or whatever term you want to use, we were getting phone calls on a regular basis. But the media are notorious for not putting out anything that's positive. So we had to be really careful, but also it was so a lot we'd say kind of, no, we can't, or you have to speak to the press officer, or had to jump through lots of hoops before you could actually get to have a conversation with anybody that was either from the community or linked to the community. So, and sometimes the community would say, oh yeah, we'll speak to them, but we always had to be really careful and cautious. So there has been a lot of media interest. I personally have always been quite cautious and careful not to link the two up, and that's difficult when you're trying to get positive stories out there, because I suppose it's about building a trusting relationship with somebody from the media too, and hoping that they will put a positive story. Anyway, I went on the radio and it was great. It was a matter of seconds, as it always is, but his last question was around, it was quite a controversial question around girls and education, and he threw it in right at the last minute. And I just answered it by saying we support everybody to access education. We don't differentiate between girls and boys. But even that, I was told that I could trust this man and that he was very sound and that, you know, he was very challenging, but that he will be okay. So even somebody that was recommended to me, there was still at the end quite difficult questions or questions that would be quite controversial. So I'm just quite careful about linking with the media. But I know there's been approaches from various other organisations that people from the community have spoken to more recently, and I do think it is important to show a different side, not just Big Fat Gypsy Wedding, or not just people stealing or homeless sleeping on the Marble Arch or whatever other crazy stories people come out with. It's important to show that people are working or people are living their life or living here in the UK, but I think it's difficult because it's how do you do that and trust somebody to do that. I think there is an element teaching staff feel and have, this has been something that's been said to me for many, 20 years, not just with the newly arrived Roma from Eastern Europe. They'd kind of say, oh, we get so cross, we put all this effort in, and then they go. But we always kind of said, but whatever the quality experience that you're giving them, they'll take with them. And actually, it's you that's feeling upset because they've left. It's like you that's taking it personally. For them, they've had a positive experience. You put as much as possible in whilst they're there, and they'll move on and take it with them. When the families, and it's always been our approach, you knock on the door, you have high expectations. You have high expectations of everybody. I expect that your child will get an education or take up a school place, or that's what I expect. And the way we did it in Manchester, outreach, so we'd knock on people's doors, as I was saying earlier. We had been building the relationships, and we did know the community, and we got to the stage where they were ringing us to say, oh, our brother's coming from such and such a body on this date, can you come out and get them an application form? So I think that's the first point, is it's a bureaucratic and complex admissions process. And if you don't get somebody supporting you to do that, you're not going to be able to do that. And that isn't that the families don't want an education at all. That wasn't our experience. It's just that it's complicated and quite a few form filling. So we used to support access, and then we'd support at admission. So we'd do what we would call high quality admission meetings, but we'd also remind the families you've got the admission meeting on this date. And then during the admission meeting, we'd support the families to share with school staff their experience, past experience, school experience, home experience. And at that meeting, school would also say, okay, this is what we expect of you. We expect you to wear this uniform, or dinner money's this much, or we expect you to come every day. If you don't come every day, we're going to knock on your door, or we're going to ring you. Or so just high expectations, and expectation of I want you to come to school. We value your community, and we want you to come. Just it's about equality. It's there for everybody, and we want you to come too. Also, over time, because in the early days we didn't have anybody that spoke Romani in school, we supported schools. We supported the Romani staff to develop, but we supported schools to employ people from that community. And again, that was difficult, because school staff were saying, "Oh, you're sending people that don't maybe have had no education themselves. How are they going to support somebody in GCSE maths or GCSE science?" But it was about somebody from that community being valued, supporting that community in school, and also the knowledge of the community. You just can find anything out, or organise a parents' evening, or in 2 minutes, if you've got somebody from the community, it's just easier. We also supported schools to share their good practice, so through networks. We listened, we did a consultation where we listened to what young people wanted, what their experience was in Romania, what their experience was in Manchester. We shared that with other professionals, and it supported other professionals to develop their practice to meet a need. So it was about consultation, and then sharing the findings, and then people changing their approach. I think in the early days, people really didn't know what to do. So they were grouping lots of people together, not necessarily just Roma, but lots of people that were new arrivals. And that was segregation, really. But the schools at that point, it was the only way they could deal with what was coming through their door. But that's not the case now. There have been incidents of bullying. And the ones that I can remember off the top of my head, literally it would go out in the community really fast that there'd been a fight or an incident, and then they'd all stop going. But then the schools did put things in place to kind of go out door knocking and assure parents that their children would be safe. But it had to be a multi-agency approach as well, because the parents weren't just interested in their children being safe in school, they wanted their children to be safe in school, or going to school, or walking up and down the lane. So they had to involve the police and make sure that the children felt safe. I mean, I have to say, the attendance of Roma children in Manchester is really, really good. There's been massive efforts to support the families to understand what's expected, and they go to school. We wanted to work with the girls, and we decided that we'd quite like to do a residential. And there's an organisation called Avon. Avon is, I think it's for writers, so it's to support people to write. And we stayed. They use a house about 30 miles from Manchester, and it's Ted Hughes's house, who was a famous poet, famous writer. So that gave us the opportunity to work in partnership with Avon, and we basically took a group of Roma girls to this place just outside Hebron Bridge. People told us we would never do it, that the parents would never allow the girls to go alone with us. We were by no means strangers, and that was one of the main reasons it went well, but we had to consider everything. We had to consider the dynamics of the group we took. We had to consider when we talked to the people in the house, we said the house will have to be spotless. We'll come round with somebody from the community to show them first. So we did like recce visits, and we went to the house and we showed the girls the house where they'd be staying so that they could go back and explain to the parents. The rooms were like 2 beds in a room, and as soon as the girls went, they said, oh no, we'll have 5 mattresses in this room, or we'll pull the mattresses from here. So Arvon had to be really flexible, so they had to know that these girls would come and completely rearrange the house, things would be. So we had to consider where it was, proximity to Manchester, any problems you can come and get them, they can come maybe for 2 nights and you can take them back, cleanliness, living space, you name it, we had to consider it, food, preparation of food, everything, even down to planning the food and the menus.
Were these all Roma girls?
All Roma girls, but people would, because there were different kinds of Roma girls, so there were some from different parts of Romania, so they would look at one another and say, oh, I'm more Roma than her, or she's more Roma than me, so it actually wasn't one Roma group of girls. And those dynamics we had to consider. So when we were looking at the bedrooms, we had to kind of think, oh, well, they might go together in that room and they might go together in that room. We home visited with members from the community to help persuade the mums to let them go. We had some that said, yes, they can go, but you need to bring them back Wednesday. So we had to have a backup plan of somebody that could come for them if necessary. So it was quite complicated, and people said we wouldn't do it. We did do it, and we took, I think it was 12 young girls. But also the actual course itself was very structured, and we thought, how's this going to work? Making these young girls sit down and write. And Arvon had to be flexible about that, because there was an end production, and the end production was a play. And that was what the young people were working towards, but the Arvon people who were writers had all the skills in getting them to think about writing. But we had people who had never been to school, people who could not all of them, but we had one definitely that had never been to school, not able to read and write. So we was considering interpreters, but they all stayed for the full time. Loved it. They had a lot of freedom, probably not as much freedom as maybe local kids, but for them it was quite a lot of freedom to be away from the parents and to be able to maybe walk down to the local village, or and I think they had a brilliant time, and it's an experience that they'll probably never forget.
What do you think the outcomes were?
Well, I think the outcomes for them was they got to know one another better. Some girls have articulated that they would never have really spoken to some of the girls that came. A commitment to that girls can kind of go away and can be together and can get along. They did produce a play. It was produced in a book at the end of it. But I think for the young people, the main outcome was that they was away from home for 5 nights, and just, freedom, and got to know one another a lot better.